when explorers finally breached a colossal cave system in the jungles of Vietnam. They were entirely unprepared for the unbelievable reality waiting inside. They discovered a sprawling subterranean world, complete with dense green forests, roaring rivers, and actual wispy clouds floating beneath a ceiling of solid rock. Is it possible that ancient humans once claimed this breathtaking underground paradise as their home? Could our distant ancestors have desperately retreated into the safety of this massive cavern to survive a devastating, world-ending apocalypse roughly 12,000 years ago? There is a deeply remote, heavily forested corner of Phong Nha Ke Mat National Park, right along the rugged border of Laos. This region is so untouched and isolated that it feels almost frozen in time. A place where nature still rules completely, and where you could easily imagine ancient creatures hiding within the thick, endless jungle. Inside the Annamite Mountains, there is a huge system of about 150 caves, and many of them have never been explored by people. The most impressive of them all is a cave called Hang Son Doong, which means Mountain River Cave. The name sounds peaceful and beautiful, but the cave itself is unbelievably massive. It's so big that you could fit a 40-story skyscraper inside it and still have enough space left to fly a small Cessna airplane around inside. In 2009, a team of experienced British cave explorers, led by Jonathan Sims, became the first people to enter the dark opening of Hang Son Doong. They carefully made their way inside, carrying heavy gear and stepping into a place no human had explored before. At first, things went smoothly. The team pushed forward for about 2.5 miles through the huge cave, but suddenly, they had to stop. Right in front of them stood a massive wall, around 200 feet tall, made of slippery rock. It completely blocked their path. Without the right climbing equipment, there was no way to get past it. The team named it the Great Wall of Vietnam, and had no choice but to turn back and leave the cave. But when Jonathan hit that muddy wall, he knew in his bones that it wasn't the true end of the cave. Looking far up above the 200 feet of rough, wet geology, he could clearly see an open, echoing space and the faint, teasing glimmer of light. It was absolutely clear that much more waited beyond the Great Wall. They simply didn't have the right ropes or hardware to get there. So Jonathan went home to Britain, called a couple of heavily experienced friends, and meticulously made plans for a return. 1 year later, in 2010, 7 hardcore British cavers confidently returned to the jungles of Vietnam. Some of the team members were dedicated scientists, but all of them were elite cavers. Because the logistical undertaking was so massive, they also hired a dedicated group of local Vietnamese guides to help them finally conquer the Great Wall. The ultimate goal was simple, but terrifying. Ascend the massive calcite barricade, see what was hiding on the other side, and push forward until they reached the definitive end of the cave. Among these hardcore adventurers was a married couple named Howard and Deb Limbert. For these two lifelong explorers, a subterranean discovery of this massive scale was the absolute equivalent of finding another Mount Everest, only buried deep underground. And incredibly lucky for them, they had the very first shot at its exploration. But this was absolutely not the first time the Limberts had gone caving in the depths of Vietnam. 2 full decades before Howard and Deb joined Jonathan Sims' 2010 team, they were actually the very first international cavers to visit Vietnam since the 1970s. They had embarked on a groundbreaking expedition in 1990, with crucial help from the University of Science in Hanoi. Their original plan was a systematic scientific exploration of the vast cave networks that had been heavily utilized by the Viet Cong during the brutal years of the Vietnam War. Vietnam has an incredibly long, deeply ingrained history of people actively using its massive caverns for shelter and strategy. Long before the Vietnam War even broke out, the famous revolutionary leader Ho Chi Minh actually hosted a critical, history-altering meeting inside Pac Bo Cave, located a little north of the city of Hanoi. Ho Chi Minh was the fiery revolutionary who single-handedly kickstarted Vietnam's communist regime. In 1911, he famously left Vietnam working on a French ship. He eventually settled in Paris and spent 30 long years traveling away from his home country. His friends were mostly dedicated communists and socialists, primarily located in the USSR and China. When he finally made the fateful decision to return to Vietnam in the freezing winter of 1941, he secretly walked directly across the Chinese border and moved straight into Pac Bo Cave. He lived there in the damp cave for a few critical weeks before officially embarking on the massive, bloody journey that would ultimately liberate Vietnam from French colonial rule and harsh Japanese occupation. On September 2, 1945, Ho Chi Minh proudly read aloud the official Declaration of Independence in Hanoi. 30 years after Ho Chi Minh achieved this Vietnamese liberation, thousands of communist soldiers desperately hid from devastating American bombing raids deep inside these ancient caves. Many of those specific wartime bunkers are located very near to Hang Son Doong. When Howard and Deb Limbert originally went to the country in 1990, it was to explore these exact historical sites. Over the years, they made 13 separate trips, discovered entirely new cave systems, and even helped the government establish a massive 330-square-mile national park. Today, that park attracts 250,000 global tourists a year. Geologically speaking, this entire region of Vietnam is essentially one immense solid limestone block. Daryl Granger, a brilliant geomorphologist from Purdue University, explained exactly how this underground world was formed. The land was violently forced upward roughly 40 to 50 million years ago when the massive Indian subcontinent collided with the landmass of Eurasia. Then, between 2 and 5 million years ago, powerful rushing river water began to slowly carve downward along a deep fault line, eventually hollowing out a massive, sprawling tunnel deep beneath the mountains. In the structurally weaker sections of the limestone, the heavy ceilings of that massive tunnel eventually collapsed under their own weight, forming staggering sinkholes and enormous, gaping skylights. Inside the cavern of Hang Son Doong, the modern exploration team found a thriving ecosystem completely isolated from the surface. Annette Becker, a German biologist on the expedition, found strange white woodlice, blind fish, and creepy millipedes that had all uniquely and bizarrely adapted to a life of total, pitch-black darkness. Dean Vu, a dedicated botanist, successfully identified massive plants growing in the dirt beneath the open skylights, noting that they were the exact same species found in the thick forest high above. But there was absolutely no time for the team to stop and carefully inspect the pale bugs and the giant plants. The mission was to push forward into the dark, so onward they went, hacking their way through the cave's bizarre subterranean jungle and stepping out into a gaping, echoing passageway. The Limberts looked at each other in the darkness and just knew. They knew instantly that they had officially discovered the absolute largest cave passage in the entire world. To truly understand just how impossibly big this cavern is, you need some scale. Hang Son Doong isn't big in the sense that it is long. It isn't even close to being the longest cave in the world. That award goes to Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, which is a staggering 367 miles long. Hang Son Doong also isn't the deepest cave on the planet. Variolfkina Cave in Georgia reaches a terrifying depth of 7,257 feet. But this cave in Vietnam is entirely different. It is so impossibly huge, so unimaginably voluminous, that it literally creates and sustains its own internal weather system. Precise laser measurements would eventually confirm that the main passage the British team was walking through is 300 feet wide in some places and over 600 feet high. 5 grueling days into their dark trek, the team wasn't even halfway to the Great Wall of Vietnam. Echoing through the darkness were roaring, violent subterranean rivers. One of these massive waterways is called the Rao Tho Rong River, and it thunders aggressively through the passage before vanishing entirely somewhere beyond the rock. Then it got incredibly, suffocatingly dark. Suddenly, the sheer unimaginable immensity of the cavern chamber began to completely swallow the bright beams of their headlamps. It was so completely dark that the artificial light simply could not penetrate the void. But as the exhausted team trudged on through the thick, heavy blackness, a faint, ghostly glow suddenly appeared far away in the incredible distance. They eagerly chased the light, frantically scrabbling over loose rubble and crawling their way up steep, treacherous slopes until they finally made it to the top of a high, rocky ridge. What they saw on the other side completely took their breath away. The massive top of the cavern had broken wide open, allowing a brilliant, angelic shaft of pure sunlight to completely breach the gloom. The gaping hole in the ceiling was at least 300 feet across, but the passage stretching out directly in front of them was nearly 800 feet tall. And hovering in the air, the crew was faced with actual, physical clouds. There were wispy white clouds floating peacefully near the stone ceiling because the cavern is so massive, it has its very own miniature functioning atmosphere. Below the floating clouds was a thick, vibrant green forest of ancient ferns, massive palms, and various other thriving jungle plants. The cavern was completely full of life. Little birds darted rapidly through the bright, shining columns of sunlight, apparently quite happy to live out their lives in this isolated paradise. Seeing an underground paradise like this instantly makes you wonder if other hidden places like this exist across the globe. We know for an absolute fact that our ancient human ancestors used to love living in caves. Hominins and hominids lived in caves for a staggering 2 million years, and Homo sapiens utilized them for about 80,000 years. This is exactly where controversial figures like Graham Hancock enter the conversation. Hancock famously and controversially believes that exactly 12,800 years ago, there was a massive, devastating global cataclysm that completely decimated a highly advanced global human population. He theorizes that in the terrifying aftermath of this global destruction, it is very possible that desperate human survivors actively sought shelter and safety in massive, resource-rich caves exactly like Hang Son Doong. Considering how incredibly tough it is to physically get into the cavern, it would have served as the absolute perfect hiding place from roving bands of dangerous maniacs or violent rival tribes on the surface. Plus, just think of all that readily available food and fresh water. As of right now, there is absolutely no verified archaeological evidence of ancient human beings ever living inside Hang Son Doong, but the idea is undeniably fascinating. The 2010 exploration team admitted that they wanted so badly to stop, set up camp, and simply stay in the beautiful cavern. But their official job was to keep pushing forward, and so they reluctantly did. And as they pushed on, they found yet another massive skylight. At this critical point in the journey, basic survival supplies and time were running dangerously low. An advanced scouting team was quickly sent forward to officially locate the Great Wall of Vietnam. The wall was located more than a mile away at the dead end of a massive corridor, heavily protected by a deep, treacherous trench of water. On either side of the water were towering mud walls, 40 feet high, and this mud was incredibly sticky, exactly like peanut butter. They officially named the terrifying muddy passage Pasken Dial, grimly naming it after the famous bloody World War I battle. Despite the horrific conditions, the team fiercely decided they would attempt to climb the 200-foot wall, no matter what it took. Elite climbers Gareth Sweeney Sewell and Howard Clark were brought along on the team specifically for this. Sweeney was so dedicated to the mission that he actually had to passionately convince his wife to sell their only family car, just so that he could afford the flight to join the expedition. Meanwhile, his partner Clark creatively funded his trip by making his money selling bull semen. On the very first day at the base of the Great Wall, Clark expertly held the safety ropes, while Sweeney meticulously and dangerously drilled upward into the rock. It took an agonizing 12 hours of hanging from the wall just for them to get the anchor holes right in the brittle stone. On the second grueling day, after a total of 20 hours of exhausting drilling and ascending, Sweeney finally, miraculously, disappeared over the top lip of the wall. Minutes later, a long, triumphant shout echoed happily back down from the absolute dark. Standing at the top of the Great Wall of Vietnam, the team could finally see bright daylight visible at the very end of the tunnel. Dropping carefully down the other side of the Great Wall, the whole exhausted team began ascending a massive, natural rocky staircase pulling them toward the daylight. Along the way, Clark suddenly knelt beside a shallow, dried pool of water and excitedly called the others over to look. Resting perfectly inside the dried pool lay a cluster of cave pearls. These tiny cave pearls are essentially the miniature, underground version of another massive global mystery: the enormous stone concretions you can see resting on certain beaches around the world, like the famous, enormous boulders of New Zealand that have been slowly growing on the coast for about 60 million years. Pushing far enough into the thick forest to clearly see the horizon, they officially confirmed that this opening was the absolute true end of Hang Son Doong. Speaking of geological mysteries that look completely man-made, nature absolutely loves to present us with a good baffling puzzle. From tiny, perfectly round cave pearls to massive, car-sized stone spheres, these bizarre symmetrical objects have mystified human beings for centuries. Let's take a quick trip across the globe to the country of New Zealand, traveling far down the Otago coast to a place where magnificent, perfectly round boulders lie heavily washed in the ocean's surf. These specific stones, officially known as the Moriki boulders, can be found resting heavily on Koakohi Beach. Mainstream geologists boldly state that these massive spheres are simply mineral concretions, essentially nature's very own giant marble collection, slowly and meticulously made over the course of millions of years. But what if there is actually far more to the story than just slow-moving minerals? According to ancient, deeply held local Maori customs and oral traditions, these massive boulders are actually the petrified remains of ancient food baskets that washed ashore from an ancient, legendary wrecked canoe known as the Erai Uru. To other outside observers, however, these perfectly round stones look exactly like something deliberately manufactured by the hands of giants. What if these huge, heavy marbles were actually formed by the intelligent hands of beings who lived on this planet long before we modern humans did? This is exactly the point where the eager, ancient mystery crowd, loudly led by controversial figures like Graham Hancock, starts enthusiastically connecting the historical dots. When you step back and look at the entire globe, you truly only see these mysterious, perfectly round spheres in a very few, highly specific places. Then we have the war-torn nation of Bosnia, where massive, perfectly round stone balls are actively claimed by some to be the undeniable remnants of a totally lost, highly advanced European pyramid culture. In Bosnia, some of these massive stones actively appear to be completely unfinished by a creator. The boulders sitting in New Zealand are often broken wide open by the surf, but the ones sitting in the forests of Bosnia look exactly as if an ancient sculptor simply stopped halfway through making them and walked away. Semir Osmanagic boldly claims that each and every one of the Bosnian stone spheres was deliberately and artificially glazed with a protective coating immediately after they were constructed. And in the small, quiet village of Zavidovici, massive stone orbs were found built from the exact same material as the local ancient megaliths. In the year 2016, Samir Osmanagic discovered a massive, unbelievable stone ball deeply buried in the dense forest of the Visoko Valley. It was the absolute biggest sphere ever found in the region, weighing an astounding, mind-bending 30 tons. To the untrained eye, it looked exactly like someone deliberately crafted this massive, flawless iron bowl and then purposefully buried it to hide it. Mr. Ind, Osman Aguch passionately believes that the continent of Europe was once home to an extremely advanced, highly capable civilization in the distant, unrecorded past. But what has he actually physically found buried in the massive hills that he claims are pyramids? In the year 2006, he officially hired a highly trained team of professional geologists from the University of Tuzla to scientifically analyze deep core samples taken directly from the massive Zosika Hill. The geologists carefully studied the dirt and rock and conclusively determined that the hill was composed of the exact same natural matter as all the other hills and mountains in the entire surrounding area. There was absolutely nothing artificial, man-made, or engineered discovered in the core samples. Paul Heinrich, a highly respected archaeological geologist working at Louisiana State University, firmly stated that what Osman Ajic is loudly calling a pyramid is nothing more than a completely normal, natural geological hill. And as of right now, that is exactly where the debate stands. There is absolutely no verified archaeological evidence that these massive hills are actually pyramids. The massive stone spheres, however, remain deeply intriguing and slightly harder to completely dismiss. What do you think about the giant stone spheres and the towering pyramids of Bosnia? Is it just incredible natural geology at work, or is it the undeniable suppressed evidence of a totally lost, highly advanced civilization? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below.